No nationalist movement impacted the collective consciousness of the 20th century as harshly as the German National Socialist movement. A German people castrated and impoverished after the First World War rose again as a world power in the midst of a patriotic ecstasy of racial pride and social welfare, only to end a few years later with a Germany full of rubble floating in a Red Sea and stripped of its sovereignty. After its main leader, perhaps the most important mind behind the fierce and earthy National Socialist adventure, bears the name of Joseph Goebbels, the Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda of the Third Reich. But he was not just a cold and brilliant mind for propaganda, but an exceptional speaker, a formidable ideologue, a political expert, and a shrewd strategist for taking and maintaining power at all costs. From the rise that National Socialist Germany experienced and the World War that followed, no side has been free from simplistic and biased analysis, especially the losing side. If one truly seeks to learn from these violent experiences, it is a duty to approach them in the most objective way possible. Today we are going to learn about the life of Joseph Goebbels. This is Rinaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and we invite you to like this video, leave your comments, share it with your acquaintances, hit the bell so you get notifications, and support us on our Patreon so we can continue to bring you exclusive and quality material for everyone. Joseph Goebbels was born into a devout middle-class Catholic family in the small town of Reich, south of Mönchengladbach in Germany. His father, a factory worker and accountant, and his mother, from a farming family, saw him born on October the 29th, 1897. By that date, Germany was only 22 years old since it had unified as a single nation-state, the Empire, under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck. The sibling states during the 20th century were one of the most important economic, cultural, and Christian centers in the world. Well-behaved, Goebbels was the most outstanding student in primary and secondary school, as well as very skilled at the piano. Without much physical attractiveness, with chronic lung inflammation and one leg shorter than the other due to a bone infection at an early age, his limp and physical frailty were compensated with extraordinary intelligence, a quick tongue, and a melodious voice. In high school, he tried to join World War I but was denied due to his disability. With the help of the Federation of Catholic Students, of which he was a part, he managed to get a scholarship to study Germanistics, history, and philology at various German universities, earning a doctorate from the University of Heidelberg in 1921. It's important to contextualize that a few years before he earned this doctorate, the German Empire had crumbled under defeat in the First World War and under an internal communist revolution in the midst of the war. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to minimize its army, to surrender significant territories, many of which were German-populated, and to pay extremely high economic reparations. Similarly, for their reconstruction and to start paying these reparations, they were forced to receive loans with extremely high interest rates from international banks. A new constitution was approved, establishing Germany as a parliamentary democracy while preserving the name of the German Empire. Thus begins the political and military transformation of Germany into a parliamentary democracy. Thus begins the period known as the Weimar Republic from 1918 to 1933, a period characterized by constant political upheavals, social decay, and a severe economic crisis. On the other hand, it is also necessary to contextualize that there was already a long-standing conflict and debate in Germany about the place in that country of members of the Hebrew religion, whose most common name we will avoid due to the demonetization policies of this platform. Members of the Hebrew religious group had already been expelled at least 3 times from brotherly territories between the 14th and 16th centuries, accused of usury and of being subversive to internal peace. During the 19th century and under the rule of Otto von Bismarck, it was not unusual to see almost all political factions referring very critically or even disparagingly to this group. It was a matter that was publicly debated, especially whenever members of this group gained more spaces in key institutions of the country. Resentment against this Hebrew group existed long before the arrival of the National Socialists, And during the post-World War I decline, it reached very high levels due to those who saw them as responsible for the defeat and the country's internal revolutions. Returning to Joseph Goebbels, once graduated, he returns home with the dream of becoming a writer. After a job he detested as a stockbroker, he works as a journalist without much success and as a private tutor. Since then, his articles already showed a sharp criticism of what they called soulless materialism and the modernist culture in which Germany was immersed. During this time, Goebbels was in search of an identity and also begins to separate from the Catholic religion. He immerses himself in the work of Dostoevsky, Stuart Chamberlain, and Oswald Spengler, famous for his work The Decline of the West. He also reads the socialist ideas before and after Marx. By 1923, he begins to take an interest in the National Socialist German Workers' Party. This party had been founded in 1920, and its genesis was in the groups of former soldiers who had unified to fight various communist revolutions that had unsuccessfully risen in various regions of Germany. Defenders of an ethno-nationalism akin to a sort of conservative socialism that came from the time of Otto von Bismarck, opposed to capitalism and Marxism, the party captures Goebbels' interest after the failed coup d'etat led by a man named Adolf. Convinced by the party's program and the charisma of its leader, he formally joins in February of 1925, and in a very short time begins to stand out for his talent to combine letters and political ideas, added to excellent oratory. Adolf manages to win the loyalty of Goebbels, who for a time was hesitant between the struggles of the party's internal leadership. By 1926, Goebbels is appointed as the party's district leader for Berlin. The Berlin metropolis was one of the party's weakest areas, but Goebbels quickly infused the section with a new dynamism, taking control of the Sturmabteilung and the Schutzstaffelei, emerging as a skilled organizer and public speaker. He had the challenging task of winning the support of the working masses who were very prone to Marxist left, while also seeking sympathies within the middle classes. At this stage in Berlin, Goebbels begins to develop novel techniques, not only of propaganda, but of political articulation in general. He said that he who conquers the streets conquers the masses, and he who conquers the masses conquers the state. He begins to organize small ceremonial marches in the streets with songs and flags, encourages street clashes with communists that would publicize the party, innovates in the design and type of phrases used in pamphlets and posters. His speeches were very well planned and rehearsed, as well as the entire staging. He founded his own newspaper and established a school for training in oratory, understanding that above books and economic political programs, people would primarily follow preachers. Goebbels also never missed an opportunity to use humor and sarcasm. He was very skilled at making jokes about the adversary. When Chancellor Brüning refused to appear in the debate to which he had been challenged, Goebbels debated in the auditorium against an empty chair with a photo of the Chancellor and a recording of his speeches, with a wit and irony that provoked laughter in the Berlin public. Thus, Goebbels is the architect of the foundations that would allow the party to expand abysmally in the coming years. In parallel to all this, the Weimar Republic continued to decline, inflation and unemployment were fierce, while the banks punctually demanded their debt payments. The political landscape was turbulent with the growth of Marxist groups, while the liberals, conservatives, and social democrats in power did not guarantee stability. Culture, press, and art promoted vulgarity, vices, libertinism, and pornography. The German people felt castrated, having gone in a few years from a vigorous empire to a degraded republic. Not a few Germans, among them Joseph Goebbels, viewed with suspicion and resentment the high presence of members of the Jewish religion in the main positions of the Communist, Social Democratic, and Liberal parties, in the main newspapers and film studios, in the lending banks, in the capitalist funds that bought German properties at devalued prices in the midst of crisis, and in the leaders and editors of the Weimar Constitution. It is in this context that an ethno-nationalist group like the National Socialist Party emerges, which exalted the German race and conceived of the nation as a mystical union of blood and soil, with the right to exclude those who were not part of that bond, directly pointing from its beginnings to the members of the Jewish religion. The original party program called for the unification of the Germans to build a great Germany with a series of political, economic, territorial, and social transformations that are impossible to summarize. Goebbels was already becoming the great disseminator of the National Socialist postulates. Love and industriousness for the motherland, the German racial unity, self-determination of the people and recovery of old German territories, an economy based on work and not on usury, exclusion of Jews and foreigners from all territory. If necessary, promotion and distribution of private property oriented to the national good, freedom of worship as long as it does not attack the values of the Aryan race, and a strong centralized state that guarantees national welfare and oversees all the living forces of the country, in addition to the elimination of the Treaty of Versailles, among many other postulates. In the same way, the movement rejected Marxism, materialism, liberalism, and capitalism as responsible for the German debacle, and as ideologies that had been created by members of the Hebrew religion alien to the German nationality. Goebbels in 1928 wrote, quote, "They are not our race, our land, and our morality." When are they our race, our land, and our morality? When have they been seen working instead of looting, corrupting, and living off the sweat of others? This will change when we are truly Germans, end quote. During these years in Berlin, Goebbels made one last unsuccessful attempt to enter the literary and theatrical world. Definitely politics was his destiny. So much so that despite the numerous women he was with during this period, he rejected any kind of formal relationship that interfered with his career. After conflicts and internal disputes, Goebbels is finally appointed in 1930 as the party's director of propaganda. This was the final consolidation of Goebbels as part of the National Socialist nomenclature. From that position, he built a small empire of over 120 newspapers nationwide, along with various dissemination and agitation mechanisms. Elected as a deputy in 1928, he sought as much controversy as possible in Parliament to gain media projection. More than once he had to appear before courts for defamation complaints, not without earning the ovation of many people for his harsh criticism of the corrupt political class. His efforts have earned the party notable support from the youth. Before coming to power, they had already won almost all the student federations in the country. Around those days, he also meets Magda Richels, a divorcee whom he would marry. Adolf would be the best man at the wedding. At the beginning of the 30s, the German government coalition was faltering and economic chaos reigned. In the 1932 elections, the National Socialists went from 12 seats to an astonishing 107 seats in parliament. The party's political, electoral, and propaganda organization gained relentless momentum under the hand of Joseph Goebbels. Months later, as a result of political fragility, the elections are repeated and the National Socialists obtain 230 seats and 14 million votes. While street violence between political factions was unleashed with over 100 deaths among the different sides, the president of the parliament, Hermann Göring, demanded that the government ensure peace. Goebbels, in turn, had been building the image of Adolf as the great leader that Germany needed to achieve unity, peace, and rise from the ashes in which it had been since the First World War. Finally, after achieving an alliance between National Socialists and Conservatives, Adolf is appointed as Chancellor of Germany by President Hindenburg on January 30th, 1933, in an attempt to stabilize the country. In this way, Adolf and his movement reached the most important position in the German state, in the midst of a country economically devastated and on the brink of civil war. That same day, to celebrate this long-awaited moment, Goebbels organizes a torchlight parade through Berlin with 60,000 militants. A month after his appointment as chancellor, the famous Reichstag fire occurs, pointed out as an attempted insurrection by the communists. President Hindenburg and Adolf's cabinet issue the decree that suspends civil guarantees and initiates the de facto outlawing of the Communist Party. The following month, Parliament approves the so-called Law for the Remedy of the Needs of the People and the Reich, which granted legislative powers to Chancellor Adolf. Thus began the end of the Weimar Parliamentary and Democratic Republic and the transition to a National Socialist dictatorial republic. Goebbels was a key player as the brain and executing manager behind the party's policy. Despite the anti-capitalist and anti-bourgeois rhetoric, the National Socialists received significant funding from large European companies and even from Wall Street tycoons and international banking such as the Rockefellers. Over time, they toned down the anti-capitalist rhetoric to focus on anti-Marxist and anti-Jewish religion rhetoric. The German government begins a process of penetration and unification of all the living forces of the country. Through genuine persuasion or direct coercion, the business community, banks, unions, civil associations, agricultural groups, schools, media, and clubs of all kinds align with the strategic goals of the National Socialist program. Many companies are also privatized, and there is an attempt to replace the gold standard with the so-called labor standard to issue money and thus take greater control of their country's finances. With strong state supervision and a policy of grouping corporations, inflation drops substantially, industry and purchasing power grow, and unemployment disappears completely. On March 7, 1933, Adolf appoints Joseph Goebbels as Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, being the youngest in the cabinet at only 35 years old. From there began a process of large-scale education and propaganda, making use of all means linked to cultural and intellectual life. In turn, Goebbels was one of the minds that drafted the decrees and other communications from the Chancellery. Throughout all these years of government, Goebbels is the great architect of the direct and indirect supervision of the press, academia, cinema, art, music, and government propaganda, kinds of mechanisms such as the grouping of each media guild, or kinds of mechanisms such as the grouping of each media, artistic or educational guild into different government subchambers that govern them. Goebbels dictated the major communication lines of the main media. The National Socialists were also pioneers in the use of radio and cinema as means of mass propaganda. The government also begins a policy that intensifies over the years to marginalize, deport, and neutralize sectors of the population of Hebrew origin, as well as other groups considered contrary to German interests. It also represses thousands of dissidents who could compromise the stability that the regime had finally achieved. Goebbels also organizes the so-called action against the anti-German spirit, which sought to recover patriotic values in academia and literature. The most remembered manifestation of this policy were the famous book burnings, where the works of authors such as Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Sigmund Freud, and many other authors who, in the judgment of the National Socialists, promoted communism, atheism, vices, libertinism, and other ideologies that they believed had characterized the economic, moral, and political subversion of the Weimar Republic. Radio stations from all regions were supervised by the Reich Broadcasting Corporation. The Reich Film Chamber regulated that films contrary to National Socialist morality were not broadcasted. The state acquired Germany's biggest film studio. Authentic mega-productions of fiction and documentary were produced to promote the government's ideology, such as the apocalyptic documentary called Triumph of the Will, films that glorified the German past, or fiction films that subtly promoted the programs the German racial unity was above anything else, including God and religion. They were neither a conservative nor traditionalist. Goebbels, already stripped of any Catholic past, saw an irreconcilable opposition between Christianity and National Socialism. This led some spokespeople of the German Church to condemn racialism, ethnic persecution, and eugenic programs as contrary to moral law. Hundreds of priests, nuns, and religious laypeople were arrested. Catholic publications were neutralized, Crucifixes were removed from public buildings, Catholic education was reduced in schools, and during the war, convents and ecclesiastical properties were expropriated. Goebbels was one of the most anti-clerical in the government, accusing the church in numerous speeches of being a morally corrupt institution. However, the Führer ordered a reduction in hostilities against the church in 1937. While all kinds of hostilities against the population of Hebrew origin were beginning to intensify, it is very common to attribute to Goebbels the phrase that, if you tell a big enough lie and keep repeating it without stopping, eventually people will believe it. However, in honor of the truth, there is not a single trace that this is his authorship or that he said it at some point. Rather, he was a proponent that effective propaganda had to be accurate and based on truth. Beyond that, in practice, he undoubtedly resorted to lies. Goebbels in 1934 said, quote, "Good propaganda does not need lies. It is a mistake to believe that people cannot accept the truth. It is only a matter of presenting it in an understandable way." End quote. Numerous historians assert that the information policy of Germany during the war managed to be superior to that of the Allies in terms of the monolithic nature of the information and regarding which information was taken as more credible and serious by the non-involved countries. The truth is that after this period of relative peace and exceptional economic growth, due to multiple factors that deserve a separate video, and against the wish of the majority of the European population, the main powers of the old continent initiate what would be remembered as the Second World War. The continent would sink into a sea of blood of millions of valuable Europeans in which no power was left with clean hands from serious crimes. Internally, the first years of war were easy for Goebbels as Minister of Propaganda, as the German victories alone were enough to boost the morale of any German. Externally, the majority of mass media in territories occupied by Germany also came under the supervision of Goebbels. All information that was transmitted was more rigorously controlled than ever, as was done by the other powers at war, from music and cinema to the news that was now broadcast in more than 53 languages. Adolf himself, in the early years, personally reviewed a special weekly newsreel that was mandatorily broadcast in every cinema program. Goebbels did not hesitate to use any event during these years that he could take advantage of communicatively, such as the Katyn massacre perpetrated by the Soviets on the Poles, who were allies at the time. But Goebbels' real challenge came in the last 2 years of the war, when the German troops began to suffer terrible defeats, German cities were being bombed indiscriminately, and basic goods began to run short. It was during this dramatic period that Goebbels proved his skills as a mastermind in shaping public opinion. Historian Heiberg writes that Goebbels was able until the last minute to maintain the hope, morale, and blind faith of the population in their Führer. In the midst of the harshest agony, the German people remained loyal to Adolf's flag and kept the faith. The supreme leader was decreasing his public appearances and speeches, so the modest young man from Radar, named Goebbels, ended up becoming the main voice of the government for the German people, while on the 18th of February 1943 at the Sports Palace, after the defeat of Stalingrad, is especially remembered for the emotional effervescence it unleashed in the public. He said, "The nation is ready for anything. The Führer has ordered and we will follow. We believe unshakably in victory. We see it before us. We just need to reach it and subordinate everything to it. People, rise up and let the storm break loose." End quote. After Adolf's speeches, there hadn't been such a deafening and fanatic ovation scene. By then, the German economy was still functioning as a normal economy, and Goebbels was a proponent of the concept of total war, which the country had not yet embarked on. Simultaneous to this, Goebbels was one of the first officials to acknowledge to the German population the seriousness of the situation and the possibility of a defeat. The Allies and the Soviet Union were advancing forcefully, Mussolini had fallen, and German cities were being bombed daily. Goebbels is one of those who proposes to Adolf that the responsible thing was to negotiate the cessation of hostilities, but Adolf categorically rejects the proposal. While other high-ranking National Socialists began to fall apart, Goebbels still dared to appear in public, in person, in front of the masses, and managed to restore faith and hope with his speeches. In addition to his propaganda work, Goebbels also has to assume organizational functions in 1944 as plenipotentiary for total war. He is in charge of ensuring that industry, energy, transportation, telecommunications, education, food, and fuel networks continue to function in Germany amidst the chaos of war. But defeat was imminent. Millions of Germans fled westward. Goebbels makes his last radio broadcast on April 19, 1945, maintaining the same eloquence and controlled passion as always, while acknowledging the gravity of the situation. He declares that he would fight to the end and die with his children defending the capital city. Adolf dictates his last will and testament and delegates as the new Reich Chancellor none other than Joseph Goebbels. On April 30th, Adolf takes his own life according to official versions. With him also died the National Socialist adventure. At the end of Adolf's testament, Goebbels writes that the only order he would not fulfill from the Führer was to flee from Berlin as the new Chancellor, and that for reasons of humanity and loyalty, he would die with his wife and children by the Führer's side. Goebbels refuses to join the high-ranking officials who were preparing to flee. He sends a message to Adolf's personal pilot that said, "Tell Dönitz that we are not only capable of living and fighting, but also of dying." Finally, with testimonies that vary the details, Goebbels and his wife ended the lives of their children before ending their own. From the ecstasy that raised Germany into a new power, only rubble and death remained. The last commander of the defensive area of Berlin was now authorized to ask for unconditional surrender to the Soviets, thus ending the war earthquake that Europe lived for 4 years. The 20th century, the so-called century of progress and science, was also the century of the crudest wars in the name of the new modern ideologies that replaced God. In the name of democracy, communism, freedom, and nationalism, more people died in less time than in any other conflict in history. The German case is of special significance because, unlike the movies of heroes versus villains, every tragedy has not a justification, but causes that are often simplified, trivialized, manipulated, or hidden. The human storm that had among its protagonists National Socialism takes shape in an industrious, disciplined, and proud people who had been humiliated, impoverished, and bombarded with cultural and political forms very different from their own. In Joseph Goebbels, they found the mastermind to exalt the deepest ambitions, the contained resentments, and the hidden arrogance of a German people who aspired to be at the top of the world again. A politician and communicator par excellence who mobilized the aspirations and resentments of an imperial nation towards an apocalyptic ecstasy of national resurgence that resulted in millions of brotherly bodies fallen in the fields and streets of Europe, and German sovereignty divided among the powers that sought to combat it. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. I hope you enjoyed this video. This is the New Encyclopedia. I invite you to like it, share this material with your acquaintances, leave your comments, and follow us on our Instagram account called The New Encyclopedia. Until next time, and may God bless you.